Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Catherine, for letting me speak today. My name is Caleb Reichle, and I am one of 5 grandchildren of John Carey. Also here today is my brother, Nathaniel Reichle, and John Henry, my cousin. And I saw Shanoa earlier. I don't see her right now, but she was here. And Miho is our other cousin. Nathaniel Reichle, on whose behalf I will be speaking, we have been requested to provide a quick speech just highlighting some of the many reasons our grandfather was just such a good man. I will try to accomplish this task, but more than likely than not, I will fail because of the insurmountable depths of detail that I could go into of why he was such a good person. Therefore, I will try to be brief, but still try to convey an accurate account of why my grandfather was so spectacular. Now, many of you have your own glimpses and recollections of just who John Carey was. And though I have no doubt they are true, this time has been given to my brother and I to quickly delve into what he meant to us and why. The earliest memory I have of my grandfather is one where my brother and I were sitting down in a little red wagon and we were being towed by him. This happened many years ago, and if you were wondering how I could possibly remember such an underwhelming occasion so long ago, I can tell you it is partly because we have a picture of it on our wall, and also because it was so significant to us. Another fond memory I have of him is an occasion where on the floor of his living room, I was racing my tiny toy cars across the room. Now, the interesting portion of this memory, and granted, I only started to understand the true depth of this meaning much later, was when my grandfather walked out of the dining room and just sat down in his notoriously comfy chair. And I would like to take a moment to illustrate just why this was so significant. If you can picture this, lunch was on the stove, chores still had to be done. The daily newspaper had just arrived, and we were preparing for a cookout that evening which still had to be assembled. There was a lot of legal stuff that I didn't understand that he needed to get done. And he had what felt like a library of books at his disposal that he was going to read. But he chose to simply sit down in the living room and sit down and watch me drag my toy cars across the floor. In addition, he would ask me who was winning, as if he were completely engaged in my fictitious world. Take a moment to consider just how much this meant to a little child. There was a man who took time out of his day to participate in an imaginary car race that would steal precious time from his day. It seemed like it would have seemed like it was nothing worth doing, because it would have no implication or reward for him. To me, however, this meant the world. And at the time, I was learning about General George Washington in my first grade class. And I recall thinking to myself, what a great hero, the founding father, one of the founding fathers of our nation, who was willing to surrender his authority over the entire 13 colonies at the time, even when the public wanted him to stay. Here in front of me was a man who served the public all of his life, who fought in the Pacific during World War II, and who served as part of the United Nations. And he was just willing to surrender his authority to my imagination. And he was willing to make his entire world stop just so his grandson could enjoy his company. I recall saying to myself, if General George Washington can show humility like he did, then my grandfather must be 1,000 more times humble than him. Please also remember that I was very young at the time and couldn't wrap my head around that. Now, I could go on for the next few hours about my grandfather, but in the interest of time, there are just 2 more events that I'd like to share. Memories, I should say. The first one, which happened more recently, was an event where I was performing as a part of the Hill Country Youth Orchestra, and I was performing Vivaldi's Autumn. Before I recount this event, I would like to inform you that my grandfather's favorite composer was Vivaldi, as many of you know. And he had heard this particular composition, Autumn, many times. Now it happened that this was the first piece I played after moving up to the advanced section of the orchestra. Consequently, it would mean I would have to perform on a gigantic stage in front of a bigger audience. And while it was really not very different from past years, it was different because now I was front and center and had to tackle a huge composition with many difficult stanzas. In the weeks leading up to this performance, my grandfather, who always present for my humiliating practices, there was no simple, this was no simple challenge, I should say. And my grandfather knew that I would have to put in a lot of work before I was ready to perform. Nevertheless, throughout all of my practices, which, by the way, was just my fiddling with the notes in front of my grandfather till they were correct, I never knew a harsh word of criticism from him. This was a piece he knew by heart, yet every time I fumbled a string of notes, I was only ever greeted with either, "It sounds lovely," or "You've almost got it." Before progressing with this story, I would like to point out that my grandfather's kindness, above all, was unmatched and unrivaled in my opinion. But back to the story. When the fateful day came and I had to perform that piece, as I stepped out of the car to go backstage, once again I was greeted by my grandfather's kindness. "You're going to do great," is what he said. To sum up this story, I played the piece the best I had done yet, and after the concert, my grandfather's first remarks were, "Your notes were spot on," followed by, "You didn't miss any." I think my grandfather is a wonderful example where his kindness and patience led to an ability to return a beautiful investment. In essence, he was able to reap a perfect melody from me by simply being reassuring and kind. Now there is one last story which I would like to leave you all with, and it is one from an event that happened this last year. Now you're probably wondering how I can tell a story of my grandfather 3 years after he passed away. Well, it's not a story where he partook, per se, in the events, but rather, it's a story of how I was faced with some challenges, and I used the lessons he had taught me and the ideology of his stature to help guide me as I conquered these particular situations. During my senior year of high school, while taking a capstone econ and government class, I had to participate in a simulation of life in politics. How this worked is we were given a small town setting called Gibsonville, whose land had recently been flooded by a major storm that submerged most of the city. Then as a class, we had to nominate an individual to run for mayor of that town on a solution to fix the problem at hand. Then each of these 3 classes had to send their nominee to compete in an election campaign against one another, facing real-world issues. The campaign was an extensive process where I had a campaign manager and it included a debate. If you saw my mom's Facebook page, you probably know that I did in fact get the nomination from my classmates, and it was unanimous. I had to represent my class in running for mayor. Now, we come to the part where my grandfather enters the scene. I had learned many things about politics from my grandfather. But more importantly, I learned the essence of what makes good competition from him. Simple things like not cheating, always sticking to what you believe in, and staying true to your word are just a few examples of the many life lessons my grandfather shared with my brother and I. I strictly obeyed these guidelines during the campaign, even when my competitors did not. In fact, I continued to follow all of the rules set by my teachers regardless of what everyone else was doing. All because of what my grandfather had imbued me with, the mindset of honesty. It came as a great relief to know that my honesty paid off, and I did end up winning. However, something else was more noticeable. During the closing remarks of the last speech I gave, one of my competitors said during his speech, "You know, you should just vote for Caleb. He actually put in the work." To me, this is a picture of my grandfather, and though he is no longer living, I had and will always have his life lessons and stature to support me no matter where I go for this story. I have to give my grandfather the credit, for if not by the grace of God and the time my grandfather invested in me, I would not have won. But stories aside, John Carey was one of the most caring and honest men I ever knew. His ability to carry himself with such dignity and yet make time for the children that played with toy cars is baffling and shows just truly how wonderful of a man he was and why he should be remembered. Whether it be by towing my brother and I in a little red wagon or by a word of affirmation, every moment with my grandfather was dear to my heart and will be treasured for a lifetime. Thank you for your time as you have come out here to honor the memory of John Carey, my grandfather.